The Friday morning newspaper landed on Thomas Wharton's stoop with a delightful thwomp. He jerked awake in his bed, rubbed the slime nuggets from his eyes, and placed his smudged glasses on his crooked nose. Friday papers meant more to Thomas than his dear mother, who left this earthly plane only 6 months ago. Friday papers came with a weekend planner, with a listing of yard sales, garage sales, flea markets, or an estate sale. He could feel it all the way down to his corn-ridden feet that this was going to be his lucky day. He stumbled out of bed and slipped his feet into a pair of orthopedic shoes held together with layers of duct tape. He practically tripped over his bowed legs as he scooted to the front porch and scooped up the paper like a bird of prey, snatching up a field mouse before flying off to the kitchen to devour it. Thomas looked like any other maladjusted old man. His gray, food-stained, pilled cardigan covered a sweat-stained plaid shirt. You would think his salt and pepper hair was slicked back with the brilliantine of his father's generation, but you'd be wrong. That was body grease, thanks to his bi-monthly bathing ritual. He had that greasy smell about him, too. You knew it when you smelled it, and more than likely, you probably held your nose and gagged when you did. You would also think he was a 90-year-old man, what with his hunching and scooting and coughing up sputum and all, but you'd be wrong about that, too. Thomas was a mere 67 years old. Not quite young, but definitely not what his appearance led you to believe. Let's not look at Thomas anymore. He's kind of disgusting. During the hot, sticky days of summer, which made Thomas smell even worse, he scoured flea markets and yard sales and antique shows hoping to find the perfect doll. Not just any old doll, either. The dolls he collected were broken and beat up and defective, rejects, unwanted and unloved, like him. The dolls weren't without their charms, though. For Thomas, it wasn't about their dainty dresses made of lace and silk, or their hair so lifelike and smooth, or their porcelain skin that never aged, or even the shape of their tiny boobies. It was something about their eyes. Brown or blue or green, color didn't matter. Shape didn't concern him. Some of those dollies held stories and depth in their eyes, revealing a sweet old soul that only he could appreciate. If he could make an emotional connection with one of them, he'd open up his wallet faster than lightning and plunk down a musty-smelling $20 bill to own it. Thomas owned 11 dolls. He needed one more. He hadn't been able to find the final doll, not for lack of trying, and he wasn't going to give up until he found her. With one hand, he skimmed the weekend planner. With the other, he prepared a cup of extra-strong instant decaf with 6 teaspoons of sugar for the microwave. As the cup spun in a circle for exactly 1 minute and 35 seconds, Thomas flipped through the pages of the flyer with high hopes. He harumphed in disappointment. Nothing, not a single event that weekend. When the microwave dinged, Thomas reached for his cup without taking his eyes off the paper, scalding his fingertips and sending the cup of brown liquid to the floor with a crash. Without missing a beat, he prepared another cup and skimmed the classifieds for sales. One. There was only one. An estate sale. But this one was a beauty. The estate of Geraldine Fitzgerald needs to liquidate its assets in a hurry. Everything must go. This Sunday at 555 Broad Street, cash only. Something stirred in Thomas's nether regions. He danced about the kitchen, nearly pissing himself with excitement, until he slipped on the spilled coffee and fell, knocking his head on the worn, linoleum-covered floor. He wasn't due for a bath for another week, but he would have to reschedule it for this. He couldn't go to the estate sale smelling of coffee. He gave himself the once-over. He'd need to trim his crusty fingernails, hack off his yellow toenails, and take a rasp to his corns and calloused heels. Maybe take the clippers to his hair and shave the gray stubble caked with bits of food and lint from his face. If first impressions were lasting impressions, he wanted to make a show of it for his girl. On the morning of the auction, he put on his best old clothes and stopped by the basement to speak with the girls. Tucked behind the asbestos-covered furnace, which looked more like a large robot with all its arms going in different directions, was a room Thomas creatively concealed. He covered the door with stucco to match the basement walls. He even painted cracks and whitish mildew stains in the appropriate places to make it look more convincing. The hinges to the door were hidden, and there wasn't a doorknob or a lock or even a seam or a crack to show that this wasn't a solid wall. If a stranger went and snooped around, they would never know there was a secret room down in the cellar. Only Thomas and the dolls knew of its existence. He took a putty knife and slid it between the baseboard and the floor until he felt the catch of the lock. He lifted it, pushed against the door until it moved back about 2.5 inches, and slid it to the left. A sweet smell of lavender and damp mop greeted him. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, his skin tingling to life. After months of suffering and silence since his mother's death, Thomas knew this was the last day of his life he'd have to spend alone again, and man, oh man, was he looking forward to his wedding night. He flicked on the light switch. The bulb dangling above a table in the center of the room snapped to life and cast a diffused glow about the space. He kept the wattage of the light bulb low because he didn't want to hurt their little eyes. "Hello, lovelies." Dolls from different time periods lined a metal shelf. Penelope had a cracked forehead, but a pleasant personality. Nancy had a broken nose and a curious nature. Then there was Tina, who, despite her missing hand, was so dainty and petite. Their dresses were ripped or stained or frayed, their hair singed or missing. Each one was special and had their own story. One space on the top shelf was left open for the new doll, the one he was certain he would obtain that day. "I'm going to pick up another girl to make our family complete." He spoke to the dolls in a hushed tone out of respect. He was convinced he heard clapping and cheering. "I know you're just as excited as I am. I don't know what she'll be like, but I'm sure you'll all get along splendidly. I just need to make sure I have everything else in order before I go." Thomas approached the blueprint he had pinned to the wall with the seriousness of an engineer looking over a schematic. It took months of late nights, headaches, eye strain, and frustration, and it showed in the perfect design before him. The light behind him cast a shadow of his body on the drawing. Depending on the doll he'd get that day, the plan might need some tweaking here and there, but he was pleased with what he had come up with so far. He ran a finger over the spine of a blue book with worn edges on the shelf next to the drawing. He dug his nail between the page and the bookmark and flopped it open. He had all but one of the ingredients. Buying the doll would be the easy part. Finding the blood might prove a bit more difficult. Thomas had heard that Geraldine Fitzgerald had one of the largest doll collections in the county. He often sat on the park bench outside her sprawling mansion, thinking of ways he could break in to steal them. But the old bird had a security system, a doorman, a gardener, and 2 vicious poodles named Precious and Schnookums that attacked the kids riding their bikes past her house. He couldn't wait for her to kick the bucket. The woman was in her late 90s after all, but she held on to life like a reality star held on to their 15 minutes of fame. By the time Thomas made it to the estate, a large crowd had already gathered in the yard. He knew the sale was going to be huge, but not like this. Throngs of people milled about and picked over the old lady's wares as if choosing the perfect orange at the grocery store. But Thomas wasn't interested in moldy books, dusty lamps, or moth-eaten vintage clothing like all the others. For years, Thomas had stashed money from his pension from the post office in a sock drawer and managed to save $500. That was more than enough for the kind of doll he was looking for. The most he ever paid for a defective doll was $100. Thomas had a finely tuned radar system when it came to finding dolls, but so far, his dolly detector hadn't gone off. As he walked along the tables of miscellaneous household items for sale, Thomas felt a twinge here and there. There were dolls nearby. He scanned the grounds of the estate with hungry eyes, his mouth salivating, his balls twitching, and then, ding, 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 found them. He couldn't scoot to the table fast enough, but when he got there, his heart sank. His mouth dropped open as he gazed upon the discarded arms and legs, cracked porcelain faces, and lonely shoes splayed across the tabletop. It was as if he were looking over the aftermath of an explosion. "What happened to them?" His voice dripped with reverence and sadness as if he were at their funeral. The lady behind the table gawked at him as she dumped another bucket of doll parts onto the table. "What's the matter with you, Mabel? Can't you talk?" Thomas called every woman Mabel. "I can talk just fine, and my name isn't Mabel. They're spare parts. Now, unless you plan on buying something, beat it." Thomas shook his fist at her. "I'll take none of your lip." "Don't you shake your fist at me, old man. I'll whoop your ass so hard your dead mother will cry." Thomas picked up a doll arm, threw it at the woman, and shuffled off as fast as he was able before he got his ass kicked. That same arm met the back of his head with such force Thomas nearly fell over. "Don't let me see you over here again, creep. I'll call for security." Thomas barked at the woman before walking away. "Windbag." He sucked on his teeth as he passed hordes of eager buyers with numbered paddles in their hands, enraptured by the auctioneer. He craned his neck to see what was being auctioned off. A lamp. Bah! He walked on, expecting to feel that twinge of excitement when he was near a doll, hoping for it, trying very hard not to recreate it. Boxes of books and assorted junk with signs with $5 for all, scrawled in black crayon lined a slate sidewalk that led to the side porch of the mansion. The smell of musty basement and mossy earth hit Thomas's nose before he put one foot on the porch step. Somehow, though, he knew this was the way to his girl. He was close. He felt that stirring deep inside. Sounds of laughter and loud conversation met him as he stepped into the mudroom. The air was cool inside, but smelled of cat piss and cloves. He had broken a sweat from the encounter he had with the woman at the table, so a stroll through the cavernous house was just what he needed to cool off. He didn't want to meet his girl drenched in sweat. A sea of bodies surrounded curio cabinets, lamps, chairs, even light fixtures and doorknobs displayed throughout the house. Buyers took notes, counted money, and talked over strategy on how to win the item in auction. Thomas scurried through the house like a rat scouting for a morsel of food. His beady eyes scanned the perimeter of each room, hoping there was a doll waiting for him somewhere. Nothing. His senses never fooled him before. What was going on? He made his way to the bedrooms on the second floor. The master bedroom, full of its exquisite oak and maple furnishings, was completely doll-free. It was the same for the second and third and the fourth bedrooms. Melancholy grew deeper as he left one room after another without a doll in his arms. Finally, he came upon the nursery. On a bookshelf in the corner, Thomas's gaze fell upon a beautiful, dark, curly-haired, porcelain-white doll from about 1920. There she was, the one, number 12, the final piece to his puzzle. Their eyes locked, Thomas's sweaty upper lip trembled, his heart skipped a beat, and something twitched and trembled in his loins. Despite his achy feet, he clumsily pushed people out of his way to get to her, but when he was close enough to see her face, his heart sank again. There was nothing wrong with her. She was perfect. Thomas didn't want perfect. Thomas wanted a doll that had been used and battered. He wanted a doll with all the scars and markings of age and abuse showing on her face and clothes. None of his dolls were perfect. She simply wouldn't fit in. The other dolls would probably snub her and make fun of her, or worse, she would snub and make fun of them. He couldn't have disharmony and discord in his family, but he had to have her. He saved money for years. He sketched and plotted and planned. Everything was ready. All the time and effort couldn't go to waste. She would have to do. Others eyed the doll, making him want her even more. He wrote the lot number on a piece of paper, number 284. He tapped his back pocket to make sure his wallet with the $500 was still there. Nobody at this auction had as much money as he had. Nobody here was willing to pay that much for an old doll. He was sure of it. Unable to contain himself, Thomas reached out to touch her, but some woman, who smelled like perfumed toilet paper, came up behind him and pushed him out of the way. "Isn't she beautiful?" the woman said in a voice sweet enough to rot your teeth. The woman had stuffed herself into a girdle. Thomas recognized the look because his dear old mother wore a girdle until the day she died. In fact, she was buried in her girdle, per her request. The rolls of flesh on the woman didn't have anywhere to go but up into her chest, making her look as if she had 4 tits instead of 2 very healthy-sized bosoms. She wore a flower print dress that must have been in the back of the closet for over 40 years. Her pure white hair was permed so tightly it made her pink face look double in size. Or maybe she really had a big head. It was hard to tell. "She'll be perfect for my collection. I've wanted one like her for ages." The woman spoke at Thomas and not to him, and she made sure to speak loud enough so everyone standing nearby could hear. "Be prepared for a fight, Mabel." "How did you know my name?" He did a double take and cleared his throat. "Lucky guess." "It's Mabel Heloise, if you please." She took one step closer to Thomas and pounded the tip of her cane on the floor at his feet. "I've got more money than you can shake a stick at, so I'm not worried." "We'll see about that, Mabel Heloise, if you please." She turned swiftly and walked away. With every step, she thwacked the tip of her cane against the floor. The compression hose covering her legs made a whoosh whoosh sound as she walked. The white orthopedic shoes on her feet squeaked with each step. Her departure had an angry rhythm to it. Thwack, squeak, whoosh whoosh, thwack, squeak, whoosh whoosh. He would not be intimidated. If the room hadn't been full of people, Thomas would have stuffed the doll under his cardigan and walked out the door, bold as brass, but the place had the unfortunate presence of several security guards, one of which eyeballed him like a cat watching a bird. Thomas followed Mabel Heloise around the Fitzgerald mansion as he waited for the doll's number to come up in auction. If he was going to win this doll, he had to understand the ways of his foe. So what if the old bat had a lot of money? Scare tactics. He saw right through her deception. It would take more than that to deter him. But what was she buying with all the money of hers? And why this doll? He knew of all the doll collectors in the area. She was either an out-of-towner or a reclusive spinster. Mabel stopped in the master suite. "This master suite furniture would look fantastic in my spare bedroom." "No, it would look better in my bedroom. I could move my furniture to the spare and no one would be the wiser." "Good idea," a lady said as she cooed all over Mabel Heloise like she was a cherubic-faced baby with twinkling eyes and drool running down her chin. Thomas stood in the corner and glowered at the woman with her girdle and 4 tits and large sums of money. Next, Mabel stopped in the dining room and announced to everyone in this fake, sweet, hypnotic voice, "Do not bother bidding on the table and chairs. Geraldine Fitzgerald, God rest her soul, was a dear friend of mine and promised the table set to me before she took her final breath." "Horse shit," Thomas grumbled. His body grew hot as the others in the room glazed over and hung on every syllable out of Mabel's tight-lipped face. She carried herself like the sun rose and set out of her ass, and her shit didn't stink. She sucked up to the other buyers in the room at the same time she discouraged them from buying anything she was interested in. And most of the people fell for it, but Thomas saw right through her manipulation. "If she wanted you to have it, she would have bequeathed it to you in her will and not allowed it to be sold at auction." Mabel Heloise smiled thinly and wobbled toward the door, thumping her cane with every other step, but stopped when she got near Thomas. "Shut up, you old greaser," she whispered in a raspy voice. He stuck close by her until someone cried out that lot number 284 was up next in auction. Thomas and Mabel raced to the front of the crowd and stood with enough tolerable distance between them. Thomas gave Mabel sideward glances and noticed that old Mabel Heloise, if you please, watched him out of the corner of her eye. Aha! She showed signs of weakness. Thomas inhaled deeply, triumphantly, and fantasized about ripping her girdle off, setting it on fire, and taking a piss on it to put the flames out. "Number 284, just a porcelain doll made in 1922, the auctioneer said without emotion or fanfare. "Just a porcelain doll?" Both turned and glared at the other, Thomas with a defiant curl to his lip, and Mabel with her now familiar smile of condescension. "Do I have any bids?" Mabel Heloise raised her paddle and shouted out, $250. $250 as a starting bid? Thomas's ass cheeks clenched. "Why, you greedy, conniving battle-axe. $275. Everyone stared at him with surprised expressions on their faces. There were whispers suggesting he had some nerve challenging the likes of Mabel. "I have $275. Can I get $300, $325, $350? The auctioneer tried several times to get a word in, but the one bidder kept outbidding the other. The crowd oohed and awed, their heads and eyes going back and forth as if watching a ping-pong match. A tickle or a twitch of some sort grew somewhere deep inside Thomas. His skin prickled with activity, and all the hairs on his body stood at attention. He scratched at his arms, shifted from one foot to the other, and had developed a sudden urge to pee. $500, he blurted out before he could stop himself. It was all the money he had on him, and it was a cash-only auction, but he won for sure. She couldn't have wanted the doll that badly. $5.25. The crowd turned to Thomas, waiting for his bid. His knees shook and his hands trembled. That tickle or twitch he felt seconds earlier turned into a rush of heat, crawling up from his feet all the way to the top of his head until he thought for sure he was glowing red like lava. $525, the auctioneer said, as if reminding Thomas how this whole thing worked. Do I hear $530? My last bid is at $525. Going once, twice. Sold to the lady with 4 tits. The highest bid. The crowd clapped for the rich old woman. I knew he'd lose, a man said to his wife. No one ever wins when she's around, the wife said. Mabel beamed with victory. Thomas hung his head and shielded his face as he slithered behind a large row of abundant hydrangea bushes. He stayed hidden until the embarrassment had worn off. It was time to go home. But just as he was about to leave, he heard Mabel Heloise barking out orders to someone about taking her winnings to her house. The bushes turned out to be the perfect spot for eavesdropping. He could hear every word that wrinkled sourpuss uttered as she tried and failed to give directions to the poor soul she hired to drive the van. It was down this street and up this hill and behind this building, she had said, and it made the man's head spin. Mabel Heloise didn't help matters much as she didn't seem to know her right from her left. While Thomas was crouched down to the ground, he drew a map to Mabel's house in the dirt with his finger, scratching out and starting over every time she got herself lost until he finally gave up in frustration. Can you just give me your address? The man said, rubbing his forehead and clenching his jaw. Thomas smoothed out the dirt in front of him and waited for Mabel to give the man her address. 340 Maplehurst, Sonny, and I'll have none of your attitude. Thomas grinned. He didn't need to scribble that in the dirt as he knew exactly where the house was. I won't be leaving any time soon, young man, so if you would kindly put my things in the garage, and do be careful. You break it, you bought it. Look, lady, I don't feel comfortable. Look, lady? Mabel thumped her cane on the ground, the grass softening the sound, ruining the effect she was going for. It's miss, if you please. The man folded his arms across his chest and sighed. This isn't complicated. The garage is unlocked. Thomas perked up. He liked the word unlocked. It was less of a hassle than the word locked. Locked meant a crowbar and broken glass, possibly a cut or two. Unlocked meant he could slide right in that garage and take what he wanted. He stuck around until after the van driver pulled away. He waited a little longer as Mabel ran off to buy some shiny new distraction. He waited until all the others were preoccupied with bidding. To leave too soon would look suspicious. Plus, he was stuck in the crouching position and didn't have much of a choice but to wait. After he rolled to the ground and waited for his knee joints to unlock, Thomas hobbled to the bus stop that would take him home where he would have to wait a little more. He could be patient when needed. For this doll, he could wait until dark where he could be invisible in the shadows of nightfall. No one would see him, and Mabel wouldn't know someone had been in her garage until it was too late. Night came. Dressed in black pants, a dark blue button-down shirt, and a black ball cap, Thomas walked the 5 miles to Mabel's house. Stealing the doll from Mabel had a certain satisfaction to it that propelled him to walk so far on his arthritic feet. Besides, if Mabel Heloise was stupid enough to leave valuable antiques unlocked in her garage, then Thomas was stupid enough to break in and steal what he wanted. Out of breath and hunched over, Thomas finally made it to Mabel's, drenched in sweat. He hid in the shadow of a sprawling pine tree and wiped his wet face with a threadbare handkerchief. Except when he jerked off, his heart never beat so fast. The lights inside Mabel's house were still on. He leaned against a tree and checked the time on his watch. 10:30. He'd have to wait some more. This was a good thing, though, as it gave him time to catch his breath and regain his strength. He got comfortable beneath the tree and fell asleep. A bug biting him jerked him awake. His first impulse was to swat the bug away, but he ignored the stinging itch and followed his second impulse, check Mabel's house. The lights were finally out. He scrambled to his feet. Keeping to the shadows, Thomas tiptoed off to the garage and found a small window on the side closest to the house. He cupped his hands around his eyes and peered inside. Despite the lack of light, he could see the bedroom furniture she had won, a few wing-backed chairs, and some ugly lamps that no one should own, but no sign of the doll. He found a door at the back and twisted the handle. It didn't budge. He wiggled it, hoping that it would release, but nothing. He pushed his frail frame against the door, jamming his shoulder from the impact. The door cracked open an inch, but something stopped it from opening completely. There were 2 padlocks on the door, one at the top, one at the bottom. Mabel wasn't as stupid as he thought. Drat. Mabel probably wouldn't keep a precious doll like that in the garage anyway. Thomas eyed the large Victorian house, anger growing inside him as he thought about her smug face when she stole the doll from him. Bitch. The light above the stove in the kitchen was still on. Thomas peeked in the nearest window he could find. No sign of the rich old woman anywhere. He made his way to the back porch, concealed by a line of skinny poplars. He let out a breath and relaxed. He wouldn't be seen here. Instinctively, his hand found the doorknob and turned it. The door squeaked open. His heart leapt in his chest as he chuckled. Someone forgot to lock the back door. Mabel Heloise was that stupid after all. Sounds of the 11 o'clock news filled the house. The volume on the television covered Thomas's footsteps, for which he was grateful. He didn't have the nimbleness of a young man any longer, so his ability to walk quietly was almost non-existent. But he tried one slow footstep at a time, keeping his ears trained for any sounds of the woman rousing. Mabel Heloise was asleep in her recliner, television blaring, snoring like a buzzsaw. Stupid woman had no clue. The light from the TV flickered across the room, granting him enough light to see. He scanned the shelves, the end tables, the desk, or any flat surface for the doll she had the nerve to steal from him. Perched on an old Victrola, the doll stood, majestic beauty that she was. Thomas let out a trembling sigh and got so excited he forgot where he was and tripped over the old lady's cane on the way across the room to grab the doll. Mabel Heloise, if you please, stirred violently. Mabel screamed, clutching the collar of her nightgown and pressing her knees together. Get out before I call the cops on you, you nasty old man! Thomas ignored her and reached out for the doll. You keep your hands off her. She's mine. I bought her fair and square. You did not. You threw your weight and your money around like you owned the world. Thomas clutched the doll to his chest. I'm taking her. I've had enough of you. Mabel wiggled and squirmed in her chair as she tried to push herself up. I'm calling the police. You'll do no such thing. Thomas picked up Mabel Heloise's cane and smacked her upside the head with it. Shut up. The doll crashed to the floor as the woman fell silent. Thomas bent over and picked up the doll, cradling it in his arms. Hush, sweet baby girl. I've got you now. Pride swelled in his chest as the weight of his heroic actions took hold. He rescued her from a life with someone who couldn't truly appreciate her company. A life with Mabel meant sitting on a shelf, ignored and unloved. The doll was too pretty, too lovely not to have her cheek caressed, her hair stroked. Thomas bit his lip as his eyes fell upon her stuffed bosom and smooth porcelain legs. He shook the arousal off and started toward the door. Before his foot hit the first porch step, he remembered the fantasy he had earlier that day. This would be the cherry on his cake. He went back inside and searched for a scissors in the kitchen drawers. Mabel Heloise sat bleeding all over the doily on the headrest of her recliner in the living room. Thomas picked up the cane again and beat the old lady senseless until he was sure she wouldn't move. With all the strength he could muster, he tipped the old lady's body out of the chair and onto the floor. He took the scissors and cut open the girdle. The old lady's hefty tits spilled out onto the floor like a mudslide. Thomas had himself a hearty laugh as he unzipped his fly and took a piss on the girdle, shaking his dick violently till all drops of urine were squeezed out. One more time, he started for the door, but then remembered the blood he needed to carry out his plan. Unfortunately, he didn't bring anything in which to collect it, so he sneaked into one of Mabel's cupboards and stole a small juice glass. He raced back to the living room, kneeled by Mabel Heloise's lifeless body, and placed the glass beneath the stream of blood pouring out of the gash on her head. When he had collected enough, he looked down at Mabel's half-naked body sprawled out on the floor and smiled. Mabel made the mistake of underestimating him, a fault she'd never repeat again. If Thomas were a different kind of person, he might have been concerned for Mabel Heloise's well-being, but he wasn't a normal man. He was far more concerned that the doll he had just stolen saw a side of him that only desperation brought out. "She'll understand someday that I did this for her." He cradled the doll in his arms like a delicate newborn as he walked the 5 miles back home to where his other dolls and his plan awaited. "I'm sorry we had to meet this way." Thomas stroked the doll's porcelain cheek with his blood-stained fingers like he was touching the tender bloom of a rose. He caressed her little backside and ran his eager hand up her legs as he carried her to the hidden room in the basement. As the door slid open, Thomas inhaled the familiar, comforting smell of his special room. "Let me introduce you. Oh, excuse me. I don't know your name." He put his cracked lips to the doll's ear and whispered, "What's your name?" "Molly," she replied with a voice as soft as a breeze on a cool summer night. He smiled a crooked smile, his dry lips stretching over his stained and tartar-crusted teeth. "Yes, Molly." He straightened the curls on her head, fluffed up her dress, and made sure her knickers were properly in place. A rush of heat inched its way over his body as he remembered how, just a minute earlier, his hand went searching without permission. "I'll call you Modest Molly. Let me introduce you to the rest of the family." With his bony fingers, he gripped Modest Molly around her tiny fabric-stuffed waist, more respectfully this time, and approached the other dolls lining the shelf against the wall. "Girls, this is Molly. She's the one I told you about yesterday morning. She's the last piece of the puzzle. Molly, meet your new family." Cracked faces, missing eyes, mussed hair, and blank expressions stared back at him. "This is Feisty Fiona." Fiona wore a gingham dress with black patent leather shoes. She got a little burnt in a fire. As you can see, half of her hair has been singed off and her face burnt, but she's a survivor. Whatever you do, don't stare. To be sure Molly wouldn't, Thomas covered her eyes before moving on to the next doll. "This is Hannah. She's the oldest girl of the family." Thomas lowered his voice to a raspy whisper. "I'm so proud of her, but she terrifies me. I know I shouldn't tell you this, but my nickname for her is Horrid Hannah. She didn't suffer the same hardships Fiona did, but she's still a survivor. I found her on the street." Thomas's voice cracked. He pushed his forefinger into his quivering chin. "I found her on the street after a moving van pulled away from our house just a few streets over. Poor little thing was neglected and living in the gutter doing who knows what to survive before I picked her up and gave her a new life." Modest Molly didn't seem too impressed, but Thomas let it slide, chalking it up to nerves at meeting the rest of the girls. He figured she might be shy or introverted and didn't feel comfortable meeting strangers. He could overlook it. He carried Molly away from the shelf and whispered in her ear again. "I felt sorry for her, but after I brought her home, I saw them. The teeth. Don't look, don't look. I couldn't tell if it was a joke or a poor design choice of the maker. Her teeth are like fangs. Instead of the nice rounded feminine edges, Hannah's teeth are pointy and razor sharp. I can't tell you how many times I cut myself in places, well, let's just say it hurts." There was Jolly Jackie, whose subtle glint in her eye made her a lot of fun. When Thomas was feeling that itch to take a walk on the wild side, he would take a walk with her, despite her broken leg. Tiny Tina was, well, tiny, and had a crushed hand, which was never useful to Thomas, but he admired her petite frame and her spunk. Wasted Wanda had one eye due to an unfortunate altercation involving her former owner and her lover and a bottle of vodka. Modest Molly listened as Thomas introduced the rest of the girls. But all the while, she acted unimpressed, disinterested. In fact, she copped an attitude which concerned Thomas. Where was this coming from? Was it because Molly spent her life in a mansion with an old woman loaded with money? She was probably refined and well-mannered, classy even. Thomas's family was anything but. He thought the girls would be jealous and look down on her, but it was the opposite. Maybe Molly had her reasons. With the death of Geraldine Fitzgerald and a sudden and somewhat violent move, Molly's life was in an upheaval. This couldn't have been easy for her. Thomas's heart swelled with sympathy for the poor thing, but practical matters outweighed emotions. The girls had to get along with each other. Thomas placed Molly on the shelf in the upper left corner and stepped back to admire his collection. 12. Each one would bring his creation to life. Each had her own personality, her own attributes that suited his lusts. It had been a long time coming, this plan of his. Thomas heard heavy footsteps on his porch, followed by banging on the front door. He jerked out of his reverie and raced to the basement window that faced the road. A police car was parked right in front of his house. Red and blue lights twirled in the darkness. So soon? Shit! Thomas paced about the basement, his pulse racing, wringing his hands. He really killed the old lady. Someone saw him and reported him. That was why the cops were at his house. They came to take him away. His mother always said he'd end up in jail, a sick, lonely old man. But wait, Thomas snapped his fingers. They won't find me down here. He raced to his special room and slid the door shut, chuckling, the corner of his mouth lifted in a defiant smirk. He turned and faced the girls. Don't be frightened. I'll keep you safe. He picked up feisty Fiona and held her close to his chest, breathing in the scent of her scorched hair. When he heard the footsteps leave his front porch and start down the walk, followed by the rev of an engine, Thomas let out a sigh of relief. Unfortunately, this changed everything. It was only a matter of time before the police came back to his house to arrest him. He knew he would have to tweak the design and reword the ritual to fit the addition of Molly, but with the police breathing down his neck, a sense of urgency took hold of him. He couldn't work under so much pressure, but he couldn't wait much longer if he wanted to see his dream come to life. And with the juice glass of Mabel Heloise's blood chilling in the refrigerator upstairs, nothing stood in his way. The next morning, after a fitful night of sleep, as Thomas waited for his cup of decaf to heat in the microwave, he scanned the police blotter, expecting to see a sketch of his face with the word "Wanted" in block letters right below it. He held his breath as he searched the obituaries for the name Mabel Heloise Davenport. He skimmed the headlines on the front page for a break-in across town. Nothing. Not one single word about how he beat the woman senseless with her own cane. He exhaled sharply, relieved that nothing was reported. Yet. The old lady got what was coming to her. He smacked his hand on the table. If she would have played fair. He slapped the table again. Thomas took a sip of his coffee, burning his lip. He winced, wanting to throw the mug across the room in frustration. What were they going to do with him if they caught him? His pathetic life couldn't get any worse. Besides, would they lock up an old man when he probably had 5 good years left of his life? Thomas spent the next hour grooming himself before he marched down to the basement and cracked open the special room. He flicked on the light and stood proudly before his collection of broken down and defective dollies, except for Molly, of course. Ladies, today is the day. Let me look over the plans, and once I'm done... He took a deep, prideful breath into his lungs and pulled his hunched shoulders back as far as they could go. Once I'm done, my name will be splattered across the newspapers for the greatest invention known to mankind. And all you lucky ladies will have a hand in this. You're special. Don't let anyone tell you differently. A couple of the dolls smiled. Thomas was sure of it. He sat hunched over a table and studied the preliminary drawings he had made years ago. Thomas brainstormed and sketched and erased and sketched some more. A few hours later, with sweat dripping from his brow, Thomas had the drawing of what he determined was the most perfect person ever created. Finally, after 12 years of waiting and hundreds of dollars invested, Thomas put on his scrubs, washed his hands, and pulled a surgical mask up over his mouth. He approached the table like he was approaching an altar to take communion. Before him lay the necessary tools to achieve his dream, surgical knife, scissors, glass cutter, a needle and thread, duct tape, stapler, and a hot glue gun. He took a leg from this doll, an arm from that doll, and although he was afraid of them, he took the teeth from horrid Hannah. All the parts were assembled on the table. All he had to do now was to sew, tape, or glue them together. He worked on into the night. At exactly 3:07 a.m., Thomas collapsed in a chair in utter and exquisite exhaustion. He wiped his sweaty face with the surgical mask and stared at the dismembered doll bodies strewn about the floor. Sacrificial lambs, all of them. On the table in front of him was his creation. About 36 inches long was a doll stitched and duct taped and stapled and glued together with the imperfect parts of the other dolls. She was a hideous sight to behold, but Thomas couldn't have been prouder. For 12 years he had searched and searched for unloved dolls, just so he could use their broken parts to create the ultimate doll. But he wasn't done yet. Thomas picked up the last doll and tossed it in a wood crate in the corner of the room. Stuffing made of shredded fabric littered the floor. Shards of plastic and porcelain snapped and crunched under his feet as he scooched about the room, sweeping up the mess. He never took his eyes off the doll sprawled out on the table. He didn't know how to act, what to think, what to say to her, now that she was right there in front of him. In fact, he was so afraid of what he had done, he couldn't stay in the room for longer than 5 minutes at a time. His stomach clenched and twisted from nerves. He raced to the bathroom upstairs and punished the porcelain. With his gut emptied, Thomas opened the book he found in a box of junk at a rather unusual flea market. Advanced Satanic Rites and Rituals. He studied the chapter on conjuring, practically memorized it, but now that he had the doll stitched together, he didn't think the ritual fit the situation. It was for conjuring a human back to life, and not for turning a doll into a human life form. He rubbed his forehead as he paced the floor. His body was exhausted and achy, his brain addled from all the activities of the day. A knock on the front door sent Thomas flying into a wall. "This is the police," came a gruff voice from upstairs. "Open up." Thomas stiffened, certain the cop could see him through the grimy basement windows. One shaky step at a time, Thomas slunk back into the room with the dolls and slid the door shut, pushing it closed until he heard it click. He waited in the dark room, his heart pounding, his ears ringing, until he heard footsteps walking away from the house. Carefully, he stepped out of the room and checked all the basement windows to see if the police car was still parked out on the street or if anyone was casing the house. It was quiet upstairs, so he knew they weren't inside. He was running out of time. If the police were onto him, he wanted to finish his project before they sent him to the pokey. With the book in hand, he made his way upstairs to gather the rest of the ingredients. He kissed the small glass of blood. "Thank you, Mabel Heloise Davenport." He had the chicken foot, rose thorns, cocklebur, and thistle, and matches in a shoebox on the shelf in his closet. In the freezer, he pulled out the heart of a rabbit and the tongue of a raven. He was all set. Thomas raced downstairs, closing the door to the hidden room behind him. He took a small metal mixing bowl off the shelf and placed it between the feet of his newly constructed but horribly deformed doll. Since the suggested spell in the book didn't fit, Thomas came up with one on his own, more specific to the situation. He would follow the directions on how to perform the ritual, but when it came time to reciting the spell itself, he'd use his own words. "Dab blood from the sacrifice on the forehead of the person you wish to bring to life." He dipped his fingers in the blood and placed a healthy dollop right in the middle of the doll's forehead, the forehead that once belonged to his sweet-natured, pleasant Penelope. "Dab another spot of blood on the heart of the object you wish to conjure." Since she was a doll and all and didn't have a heart, Thomas did what the recipe called for. "Add the thorns and thistle to the bowl and crush them with a chicken foot 6 times to the right, 6 times to the left, and 6 times to the right once more." Thomas did as instructed. "Place the rabbit heart on the chest of the subject and place the tongue of the raven on your lips." "What? I don't want to do that." He had a moment of doubt, but it quickly subsided when he heard a police siren out on the street. He didn't worry. He was safe in his room. He continued. He put the heart of the rabbit on the spot of blood in the middle of the doll's chest and took the tongue of the raven and placed it on his bottom lip, wincing at the stench of the thawed piece of flesh. "Set the contents in your bowl on fire, and as it burns, pour the blood of the sacrifice over the flames and recite the spell below." Thomas flicked one match in the bowl. Nothing happened. He tried again. Nothing happened. He grumbled in frustration. One more try. A flash of bright light. He shrieked. As the flames grew higher, Thomas tipped the glass of the blood from Mabel Heloise into the fire. "Ashes to bone, dust to sinew, stuffing to muscle, porcelain to skin. From object to being, I beseech you, come to life." The spell said to repeat the last line exactly 6 times. Nothing mystical happened after he said it the first time. Maybe there was some power in the number 6. He didn't question it. "I beseech you, come to life." The table jumped and rumbled against the floor. Eyes wide, Thomas paused. "This is going to work." "I beseech you, come to life." The flame inside the bowl turned green, and a reddish-brown smoke filled the room. He coughed a few times before continuing. "I beseech you, come to life." The light in the room flickered. "I beseech you, come to life." The table shook violently. Thomas held onto the sides of it to keep it from jumping up off the floor. On the table, the doll rattled against the surface. "I beseech you, come to life." He heard a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He couldn't keep the table from bouncing off the floor and let go. He cupped his hands over his ears and screamed the last line of the ritual one more time. Just as quickly as it started, all the commotion stopped. The ringing in his ears had gone away, the flames had died out completely, leaving only a hint of sulfur hanging in the air. He waved his hands in front of him so he could see what the hell had just happened. He gasped, holding his hands over his heart. The doll he had pieced together now lay before him in human form, with real flesh and bones. Thomas squealed and jumped up and down, knocking his head off the light bulb hanging in the middle of the room. "It worked! It worked! I can't believe it! I did it! I'll be famous!" The object on the table moaned. Thomas gasped again and fell into the wall behind him. She began to move, and Thomas, not used to seeing a woman naked, even if she was once a doll, felt compelled to cover up her nakedness. He removed his cardigan and placed it over her. She opened her eyes and grabbed his wrist in a vice grip. "Oh my, you are a strong one, aren't you?" "Hello, my love," he cooed as he tried to pry her fingers from his arm. "I have some lovely dresses for you to choose from upstairs in my bedroom." "I'm hungry," the doll said, licking her teeth. For a brief second, he regretted using horrid Hannah's teeth. "Have any meat?" Thomas flicked his eyebrows a few times. "Oh, I have some meat for you." She cocked her head to the side and blinked slowly. You meant to eat." Thomas cleared his throat and looked away, embarrassed. The doll pushed herself up on her elbows and surveyed her surroundings. "What am I doing here?" The doll's cognitive abilities perplexed Thomas. He never thought the doll he would create into a human would actually have a brain and use it and ask inconvenient questions or want food, especially meat. "What do you mean? What am I doing here?" "I brought you here. I made you. I brought you to life. Doesn't that make you happy?" "You look familiar. Do I know you?" All the hairs on Thomas's crusty old body stood at attention. That voice. He had heard it somewhere before. In fact, he had heard it the day before when he was at the auction trying to win the doll from Mabel Heloise. It never occurred to him when he took the blood from a human sacrifice to choose the right specimen from which to take the blood. He thought any old blood would do, but a part of Mabel's soul must have come back to life when he conjured the doll to life. But what did it matter? He brought a doll to life. Woohoo, right? "What should I call you?" He didn't want to come straight out and call her Mabel Heloise in case she was still bitter about the unfortunate caning incident and wanted to bludgeon him to death with something. "What do you want to call me?" She dangled her legs over the edge of the table and tried to stand up, but fell into Thomas's arms. Thomas felt a tingle in his special place. "Can I call you Lilith?" She gazed up into his face, her eyes flickering with something. Thomas thought he heard a low growling noise coming from somewhere. "You can call me anything you like. Now, about those dresses." Thomas gently placed his arm around Lilith's waist and helped her up the stairs. She stood about 5 feet tall and was a little leaner than he had hoped, but it was a minor issue he could overlook. In the wood crate where Thomas had dumped the rest of the doll bodies, something stirred. Feisty Fiona clawed her way to the top of the box and peeked over the edge. "All right, they're gone." She glanced over her shoulder as the rest of the dollies woke up and climbed their way out of the box and jumped onto the basement floor. Pretty sure Thomas didn't count on this happening. "Oh my, what is that smell?" Pleasant Penelope asked. As she smoothed the hair off her face, she realized she was missing a forehead. "I seem to be out of sorts." Brash Betty, who was now missing a leg, hopped over to see what was going on with Penelope's face and fell into her, knocking the both of them to the floor. "Great. Look what you made me do," she said as she rolled off of Penelope. "Your stuffing is coming out of your head." "How did that happen?" Penelope helped Betty to her foot and made sure she was steady before letting go of her. Betty studied the other dolls. "We've been robbed." Feisty Fiona turned on her doll heel. "Listen up, dollies. We have a situation on our hands. That thing walking around has our parts. We have to get them back." "How do we do that?" Nosy Nancy, who always had an inquisitive look on her face and was now minus a nose, asked. "Look at us. She's missing a forehead. That one's missing a leg. And that poor little thing over there is missing a hand. My nose is gone. What are we supposed to do?" "Let's scope out the situation before making our move," Fiona said. The 12 dollies struggled their way up the basement steps and crawled up to the door. They heard talking in the kitchen. Those who still had ears pressed them to the door and listened as Thomas and his new doll friend, made from their doll parts, got to know each other better. "The dress is beautiful," Lila said. She wore a dress from the 1950s Thomas had found at one of the many flea markets he visited while looking for the dolls. It had a full skirt and hugged her torso, accentuating the plump breast once belonging to lusty Linda. Lila smoothed the skirt with her mismatched hands and admired its fit. Thomas stood in disbelief at the sight before him. It actually worked. "Wow, you're so... wow!" She was quite lovely for something pieced together with defective doll parts and conjured to life with a satanic ritual. She was real. Now that he had her, what was he going to do with her? Sure, he bought her a couple of outfits, but not much else. His pension wasn't big enough to support 2 people. What if she wanted to go shopping or get her hair done? And then a horrific thought struck Thomas. What if she wanted to go out in public, date, get married, have kids? He hadn't thought this part of his project through, and somewhere in between lust-fueled thoughts of what he wanted to do with her later, panic sneaked in. Now that he had her, he'd have to deal with her. He had lived alone ever since his dear old mother died, and forgot what it was like to live with another soul. And he never lived with a member of the opposite sex. Mothers didn't count. Speaking of sex, Thomas was more than a little curious about what exactly was under her dress. Really, under her dress. Sure, he caught a glimpse of her naked body earlier when she was on the table, but he was so excited that she was alive, he couldn't think or see straight. Plus, he didn't want to embarrass her by staring too long and too hard. He licked his lips and adjusted himself at the thought of being near his creation. She spun in a circle as she modeled the dress for Thomas. She shrugged her right shoulder and looked over it coyly, then shrugged the left shoulder, looking over it the same way, sort of like a movie star at a red carpet event, posing for the cameras. "So, when do we eat?" "Well, I have to prepare something, but in the meantime, why don't you let me take you on the tour of your new home?" She hooked her arm in his and smiled at him with those sharp teeth of Hannah's. He laughed nervously. "This is the living room. It isn't much, but when you live alone, you don't need much." He made sure to emphasize how alone he was, hoping to spark a bit of empathy in the doll. Pity sex was better than no sex at all. "And this," Thomas said with lust dripping from his lips, "is my bedroom. Our bedroom. As you can see, there's room enough for 2 in my bed. Lilith, my love, my house is now yours, and you are mine, if you get my meaning." "Yes, I get it," she chuckled deep in her throat. "Can we eat now?" Something behind Thomas creaked. He jerked his head in the direction of the noise. It sounded exactly like the basement door opening, but he ignored it and turned his attention back to Lilith. "How about I make us a lovely dinner? Afterward, I can put on some soft music so we can dance. And after that, I can show you just how comfortable my bed is. This time, there was a retching noise behind him. He couldn't imagine what it could be, as it was only the two of them in the house. Once again, he ignored it. That would be lovely, Lilith said, grinding her teeth. Thomas took her by the hand and helped her to his favorite chair, which sat directly in front of the television. He showed her how to use the remote control. You sit here while I make dinner for the two of us. Lilith flipped through the channels until she came upon a slasher movie. A young couple ran through the woods as a mutant, brandishing a machete, chased after them. Oh, look, they got their heads chopped off, she laughed maniacally. Oh, no, Thomas said, lovingly. Let's watch something a little more wholesome. I think the Brady Bunch is on right now. There we go. Now you sit tight and dinner will be ready in about an hour. When he stepped into the kitchen, Thomas could have sworn he heard something scampering about on the basement steps. He lurched toward the basement door and peeked inside. In the dark, it was hard to be sure, but he was certain he caught a glimpse of something white moving across the floor at the bottom of the cellar steps. He flicked the light on, thinking he would see a small rat. One of the dolls lay on the floor. Poor thing, all torn to shreds when only days ago it was standing on a shelf. He scratched his head as he closed the door, wondering how that doll got there when he was certain he tossed all of them in a crate. What is that stuffing coming out of your mouth? Nosy Nancy asked Modest Molly. Molly was hunched over with her arms wrapped around her waist. I don't know, she managed to say. All I know is it's coming from this part. She pointed to her stomach. I know what that is, Wasted Wanda said. It's called vomit. The person who owned me used to throw up all the time because of something she drank. I don't know why she kept drinking if it made her throw up. Yes, Nancy said, but why does it keep happening? Wasted Wanda moved closer to Modest Molly and eyed her with the only eye she had left. Well, she doesn't look drunk. What happened? That man... Molly made a hurt noise and covered her mouth with her hand. He's so... He makes my skin crawl. It wasn't technically skin, but she enjoyed saying the phrase. It felt good on her tongue. Not that her tongue was real, but never mind. Anyway, he's what you would call a creeper, Lusty Linda said. Ahem, came a small voice from the shadows. Are we going to ignore the big purple bear in the room, or are we going to talk about why we are here? All the other dolls turned and stared at the little doll missing her right hand. Hi, I'm Tiny Tina, and I don't think I'm supposed to be talking, but this is way cool. None of us are supposed to be talking, or walking, or anything. Feisty Fiona stepped to the center of the circle and addressed them. But now that we are, we have to put our heads together, for those of us who still have a head, and figure out a way to go back to being dolls, sitting on someone's shelf, collecting dust like we're supposed to. I don't know, Jolly Jackie said. I kind of like this. I mean, sure, I don't have a leg to stand on, literally, but it's kind of fun moving around on my own. Or in my case, hopping around. It sure beats having that thing stuck up my butt all the time. There was murmuring among the group of dolls, all of them agreeing that being stuck on a stand, sort of like a pretty scarecrow, was a lot worse than their current condition. Sure, they were missing arms and legs and faces and eyes and teeth, but they were alive, sort of. An unexpected side effect of Thomas's project, and one he probably wasn't prepared to handle. Feisty Fiona raised her doll hands in the air to shush the crowd. But our destiny is to be dolls. We sit on someone's shelf and look pretty. We are not meant to move around and act like those creatures who do more harm than good. Hence our condition. Now that Modest Molly was able to keep her stuffing down inside her belly, she was able to speak more freely. What do you suppose we do? We can't undo what he did to us, can we? Fiona nodded. Now you understand. We have to get our parts back, and the only way we can do that is to get Thomas. At the mere mention of his name, Modest Molly ejaculated a tuft of stuffing out of her doll mouth. Sorry, Fiona patted her on the back. The only way we can do this is to get the person who did this to undo his creation. He has to dismember her so we can have our parts back and go back to being dolls. Cunning Carol stepped out of the shadows and took her spot next to Fiona. She tried to put her hands behind her back, as most cunning folk do for dramatic effect, but Carol was missing a hand, making it impossible to clasp them together. Defeated but trying to hide it, she hung her arms by her side and spoke to the crowd. I don't think that thing he created wants to be what she is. If we could somehow convince her to convince him, whom we won't name, to destroy her. No, Fiona said emphatically. We can't do that. We can't make contact with her. We can't make contact with anyone except Thomas. No one must know we exist. We are shadows and must remain so. That's the only way we can do this. Can you imagine the horror on some little girl's face if she saw one of us walking around like it was normal? Jolly Jackie clapped her hands. If I were a little girl, I would love that. You would, brash Betty said. I disagree, Carol said calmly. Our best bet is to tie her down and take our parts back with force. We can leave nothing to chance. And so we get our parts back. Fiona rocked back and forth on her heels. Then what? Thomas is the one who got us into this mess. He's the one who has to get us out. Ensnare her first, then attack Thomas and force him to obey us, Carol said a little too eagerly. We're not taking anyone by force. Okay, Miss Know-It-All. We'll do it your way. But I say you're wrong. You'll see. Stop fighting, Tiny Tina shouted. Fiona, we'll try your way first. Carol's idea is Plan B. Carry on. Feisty Fiona kneeled in the center of the huddle and drew out a plan for the other dolls. Tonight, we'll make our move. But first we need to strengthen and arm ourselves. No pun intended, since some of us can't get around as well as the others. Horrid Hannah, Wasted Wanda, Vicious Vicky, and I will perform a reconnaissance tonight and will report back. Modest Molly will stand guard and alert us if there is any trouble. Nosy Nancy and Cunning Carol, you will be our backup. The majority of the dolls agreed with Fiona. Carol shrugged and said, Okay, fine. Have it your way. Fiona continued. Now, I suggest we search for something to substitute for our missing body parts. Are we all clear? The dolls nodded and scattered about, exploring every corner of the basement for objects to replace their missing parts. They climbed shelves, dug in baskets, searched through the cupboards for anything they could find to help them. Once they finished searching, they took all the items they had collected and threw them in the middle of the floor. The dolls formed a circle around the pile of junk and stared at it. Once again, Fiona took charge. Right. Modest Molly and Wasted Wanda, take these marbles and stick them in your eye sockets. You won't be able to see out of them, but at least you'll have an eye. Both dolls pounced on the blue marble. It's mine. Wanda wrestled Molly to the ground. I saw it first. Molly kicked Wanda in the face and jammed the marble in her eye socket before Wanda had a chance to take it from her. There, it goes better with my complexion anyway. Wanda picked up the other marble, a red one, and frowned. I don't want a red eye. But the red one will make you look evil and scary, Tiny Tina said. It fits you better than you think. Tina fumbled with the marble with her broken hand and shoved it into Wanda's eye socket as best she could. She shuddered. See? You scared me. Wanda smiled proudly and stuck her tongue out at Molly. Okay, what's next? Fiona rifled through the pile of junk on the floor until she found a handful of spatulas. Jackie and Betty, take a spatula each, a roll of duct tape, and attach them to what's left of your legs. Since Molly and Wanda are taken care of, they can help you. Everyone gathered round as Molly and Wanda worked their magic on the doll's legs. Once finished, Jackie stood up and bounced up and down on the spatula, impressed with how high she could jump. Betty did the same, and before long the two dolls were holding hands and bouncing around the basement. Tiny Tina couldn't wait for Fiona to get to her, so she grabbed a back scratcher. This should do nicely. It's a little long, though. Vicious Vicky, who was missing an ear, took the plastic back scratcher and cracked it over her knee, giving the hand part back to Tina. There, that should do it. Thank you, Tina said. What? Vicky leaned in with the only ear she had left. You have to speak up, Tina shouted this time. You're welcome. Here, let me help you. Before long, most of the dolls had their missing parts restored in some makeshift fashion. Unfortunately, some of the dolls couldn't have their parts replaced. For instance, Nosy Nancy couldn't find anything to replace her nose and was stuck with a hole in her face. Hannah couldn't find a substitute for her teeth, and Vicky couldn't find an ear. Penelope wrapped a bandana around her missing forehead to keep her brains from falling out, and Fiona seemed to like the bald look now that all her hair was gone. She found something called a merkin, but decided against using it as a wig. It was too curly and smelled funny. Fiona had the dolls line up in formation. She inspected each of them, pleased with what she saw. All right, dolls, here's our plan. The army of dolls huddled at the top of the cellar stairs, pressing their faces against the door. The smell of frying meat filtered in through the crack at the bottom of the door. The mellow sounds of Lawrence Welk played softly in the living room. With every scratch and skip of the old vinyl record, Lilith jumped. The music itself seemed to have set her teeth on edge, quite literally. She chomped on an imaginary bone, rumbling noises coming from somewhere in her being.
"All right, here we are, Lilith."
Thomas gushed over her as he led her to the table and pushed the chair in behind her.
"We have a nice, juicy steak, twice baked potatoes, and green beans. Would you like some wine, my love?"
Before Thomas had a chance to unscrew the cap off the bottle, Lilith picked the steak up with both hands and gnawed on it as greasy pink juice ran down her chin and arms. She lapped it up like a dog.
"She's hungry,"
Nosy Nancy whispered.
"That's what worries me,"
Feisty Fiona said.
"We have to act fast." "Right. As soon as he sits down to eat, we'll go in."
The reconnaissance team hung about the door, prying it open little by little so as not to give their position away. All they needed was about 6 or 7 inches to squeeze their little bodies through, once Thomas and Lilith were distracted by their meal.
"How do you like your steak?"
Thomas cut a piece off of his own and raised the fork to his mouth slowly, almost like he was scared.
You must have been famished."
Lilith's cheeks were stuffed with meat. Her perfect Cupid's bow lips were coated with grease. She sucked the juices from her fingers and eyed Thomas like she was still hungry. He gulped.
More wine?"
She released a low guttural growl as she snatched the bottle from Thomas and guzzled it. Once the bottle was empty, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and unleashed a burp so loud the windows rattled. Thomas clutched the collar of his shirt.
"Oh dear, we might have to work on your manners."
Lilith picked chunks of meat from between her teeth with the tine of a fork as she watched Thomas eat his food, one methodical bite after another.
"Are you going to eat that?"
She didn't wait for an answer and snatched the steak from Thomas's plate, sucking the meat from the bone. Thomas's fork dropped to his plate with a clang. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. He ignored it, not sure if it was safe to take his eyes off Lilith.
"Well, you seem to be good and fed."
He laughed nervously.
"Would you like to dance?"
"Absolutely." A mischievous glint flashed in her eyes. "Maybe you can show me your bed a little later, big boy." A retching sound came from the basement. Thomas turned toward the noise and found the door ajar. He took a step toward it to close it, but Lilith grabbed his wrist before he could move any farther. "This way, honeysuckle." If Thomas's nether regions weren't tingling, he would have noticed more bizarre noises coming from the direction of the basement, not to mention a bald doll, about 24 inches high, standing stiff as a statue behind the sofa. As the couple slow danced in the middle of the living room, tiny feet scuffled across the kitchen floor. Vicky, Hannah, and Wanda met Fiona behind the couch and huddled together out of sight.
"Now what?"
Hannah whispered.
"Now we wait."
Fiona scoped out the room. 10 feet in front of her was the door to the bedroom. There was only one way in and one way out. This could prove to be a problem if they got ambushed by the devil doll out there seducing Thomas. That was pretty much all she had to go on, since she had no military training to speak of because she was an inanimate object mere hours ago.
"It's hard to tell how much time we have. When the time is right, I guess we'll know."
The lulling sounds of big band music scratched on the record player. It wasn't long before the dollies fell under the spell of the music, humming and swaying back and forth. Moaning and slurping and the friction of clothing rubbing against clothing broke each doll out of her melodic trance. Fiona peeked out from behind the sofa, then Vicky, Hannah, and finally Wanda. They watched in horror as Thomas molested Lilith's mouth with the finesse of a hungry piglet on a sow's teat. His moans of pleasure frightened the dolls so much that they froze out of morbid curiosity. Modest Molly gave her position away with even more gagging noises. Soon, the cardigan sweater was off and on the floor. Lilith's dress straps were off her shoulder, and before long, the dress was on the floor, same with his pants.
"Let's move this to the bedroom,"
Thomas said, panting his acrid breath in Lilith's face. Horrid Hannah had a wicked, toothless smile on her face. Boldly, she stepped out from behind the couch, fascinated by the squeaking bed springs and the grunting coming from the bedroom. 2 seconds later, Thomas yelped and howled like a wolf. Hannah snorted. "That's a mighty big finna for a two-pump chump." Fiona grabbed Hannah's wrist and dragged her back behind the sofa, almost certain the two lovers heard her laughter.
"We'll wait till they're asleep. We'll have to approach him and convince him to destroy his creation. Now, let's get out of here before we get caught."
Down in the basement, the dollies gathered around as Fiona debriefed them on what had just happened upstairs. Poor, modest Molly. She rested her head on pleasant Penelope's leg and rocked back and forth, humming to herself as Fiona filled them in on the gory details. "What was that hairy thing with oozing red dots on it and a split down the middle?" wasted Wanda asked, perplexed. "Oh, I know," horrid Hannah said, slobbering as she spoke. "I had one." She pulled her knickers down and proceeded to moon everyone. "See?" She wiggled her hips back and forth. "Except I don't think mine has hair on it." She craned her neck to check out her backside. "Does it?"
"Focus, dollies."
Fiona paced the floor with her hands behind her back.
"At 2300 hours, we'll head out. Now, here's what we're going to do."
"Hold up." Cunning Carol stepped out of the shadows. Fiona bristled at the sound of Carol's smug voice. "Don't you think we should try my way since your plan failed so miserably?" "That's not fair," Linda said. How was she to know they'd be up there having a horizontal wrestling match? Modest Molly stuck her fingers in her ears and hummed louder.
"Yeah, how was I to know?"
Fiona said defiantly. "We must plan for every eventuality." Carol clapped her good hand against the spatula in place of her other after each word for emphasis. "Life is unpredictable." Yeah, save it, sister," Brash Betty said, pushing Carol out of the way as she sidled up to Fiona. "Put your money where your mouth is, sweet cheeks." Fiona studied the faces of each doll, all with eyes pleading her to try Carol's way.
"Fine,"
she said finally.
"We'll do it your way."
"Gather round, girls." Carol knelt in the middle of the huddle. "Fiona, I'm going to leave you in charge of this mission. You're fearless, and we need that in a leader. Okay, here's what we've got to do." At exactly 11 o'clock, they marched upstairs. The lights were off, the dinner dishes were still on the table, and the smell of fried meat still hung in the air like a bad memory. Fiona led the way as the army of dolls kept step behind her. Their movements were stealth, but the patter of little feet and the rustle of taffeta and tulle punctuated the silence of the night. Fiona scanned the living room, checking over her shoulder as she advanced her position, not wanting to wake Lilith. Soon they were close enough that the snoring of Thomas and Lilith covered up their movements. Fiona held up a fist. The rest of the dolls stopped walking and waited for further instructions. Fiona gestured to Betty and Hannah to get into position, and the rest she told to scatter. They knew the plan, and if there was any trouble, retreat to the basement. Fiona crawled across the floor on her belly, all the way to the bottom of the bed. After a few tugs on the duvet, she began to climb. For a doll, she had amazing upper body strength. Thomas grumbled and rolled over. Fiona took hold of the sheet and hoisted herself the rest of the way up onto the bed with ease. Out of breath and feeling a sense of pride swelling in her chest, Fiona took a moment to get her bearings. But when she looked up, she looked right into Lilith's glowing red and piercing laser-like eyes. Fiona gasped. You would think she gasped because Lilith frightened her, but you'd be wrong. Now that she had a chance to see the hairdo Thomas made out of the remnants of her burnt hair, Fiona wanted it back. Before the fire, Fiona had a full head of blonde hair pulled back and held in place with a crisp pink ribbon. It was hair to be proud of, and someone else was wearing it. Her chin quivered. My hair! It's so beautiful! Lilith snatched Fiona by the neck and flung her across the room. As she sailed through the air, Fiona screamed, Launch the net! She flew into the curtains of the living room window, thankful for a soft landing. The patter of little feet scurried across the bedroom floor. Sounds of heaving and hefting and of rope dragging across the carpet caught Lilith's attention.
What do you think you're doing?
Fiona ran across the room and jumped on the bed to face Lilith again, distracting her from what the other dolls were doing.
I love your hair. Where'd you get it?
Footsteps scampering around both sides of the bed confounded the doll Lilith. She didn't know where to look, where to prepare herself against assault first. Brash Betty and horrid Hannah got into position, and with them they carried oranges and apples. Thomas finally stirred and bolted upright.
"What's going on? Did my snoring wake you, my love?"
Hannah pelted an orange and hit Thomas on the side of the head.
"Harry, what was that?"
"Never mind, my dear," Lilith said, her voice oozing with tenderness now. "Go back to sleep." Now was Fiona's chance to make her move. The demon doll had to be stopped. After being reminded how great her hair once looked, Fiona's body quaked with anger. She ran a hand over her stubbly scalp and shouted, "Thomas, you must destroy her. If you don't get rid of her, you'll regret it." Thomas blinked rapidly.
"What on earth was that?"
Betty lobbed an apple and hit Lilith right between the eyes.
"Die, bitch, die!"
Lilith, the beautiful sex pot that lay beside Thomas in his bed, the creation of his every fantasy, growled and hissed and sputtered and barked like a rabid dog. Thomas clutched the sheet to his throat, wanting to scream, wanting to piss himself, wanting to run, but afraid to move an inch. He finally understood exactly what the unseen voices were saying to him. He had no idea the dolls had come to life and that they were in the room with him, but he was certain of one thing, even if it pained him to say it. The thing he made love to hours ago wasn't quite right. Sure, it felt good to release all the jizz bottled up in his testicles for decades, but he wasn't willing to put his life in jeopardy just to get his rocks off. He had built a meaningful relationship with his hand and had been in that relationship longer than he had been with Lilith.
"Who's talking?"
An apple and an orange flew at Thomas, but this time he caught them in his hands. He crawled to the foot of the bed and surveyed the activity on the floor. That was when he saw them. Just outside the door, the familiar faces of two of his dolls peered at him. He let out a high-pitched squeal.
"We have to get rid of her."
Fiona hoisted herself onto the bed and stood over Thomas.
"We want our parts back. You have to dismantle her. She's going to kill someone if you don't."
She wanted to frighten Thomas into action, but the strangest thing happened. Lilith hunched her body and growled. Her eyes were locked on Thomas like a cat about to pounce on an unsuspecting bird. Before he could utter a word or cry for help, she plunged horrid Hannah's old teeth into the man's chest and ripped off a layer of flesh. Thomas fell back onto the bed, his hands and feet flinching as blood spattered the walls. Brash Betty watched in horror. Well, that was unfortunate. Lilith clenched the flesh between her sharp teeth and began to chew. Blood squirted out of her perfect lips and ran down her porcelain-like chin. Immediately, she spit it out onto the floor and gagged. Bitter. Feisty Fiona took a few steps backwards and did a backflip off the bed, flawlessly sticking her landing. She darted to the huddle of dolls where they had a rope net ready to launch. On a count of 3, they launched the net, holding onto the ropes at the end. The net spread over Lilith and Thomas, pinning the both of them to the bed. Still losing blood rapidly, Thomas lay still, feeling death creeping up on him. Lilith let out a low, guttural growl that stirred every sleeping dog in the neighborhood in a chorus of howling. With all the weight of their little bodies, the dolls hung on the ends of the rope to keep Lilith from escaping. One by one, they tied the ropes to the legs of the bed until they were certain the devil doll couldn't move. Lilith pushed against the ropes, using her razor-sharp teeth to gnaw through the restraints. Tiny Tina climbed the net and stood on Lilith's chest, riding the rise and fall of the doll's ribcage with every inhale and exhale. She shook her stump of a hand, now taped with a back scratcher, in the air.
"I want my hand back. You hear me? I want my hand back."
Modest Molly rushed to Tina's side and comforted her.
"Easy, girl."
Tina crumbled in Molly's arms and wept dry tears. Jolly Jackie took a few steps forward and was about to say something to lighten the mood, but passed out at the sight of all the blood. The house had an unnerving stillness to it that only comes after tragedy strikes. Fiona wiped blood from her cheek.
"Let's finish this bitch off."
As Lilith grumbled and growled, pushing against her restraints, Fiona and Carol stood over Thomas's nearly lifeless body, studying the gaping wound in his chest.
"He can't die," Fiona said. "If he dies, we'll be stuck like this forever. I don't want to live like this, do you?"
Carol cupped her chin with her hand. "How do we keep him alive?" "I don't know anything about humans." Lilith flicked her tongue through the netting.
Let me finish him. I need to eat.
Brash Betty jumped on the bed and kicked Lilith in the face, knocking her out.
Shut up.
Fiona and Carol gasped excitedly.
You can do that?
Fiona said.
And it works?
Carol sprang into action. Quick, get Thomas out from under the net so we can save him. The dolls did as commanded and clumsily pulled Thomas's frail, blood-stained body from under the net before Lilith woke up. Half of the dolls lay him on a bedsheet and dragged him to the living room, while the other dolls secured the net to be certain Lilith couldn't break free. Nancy and Hannah tended to the hole in Thomas's chest, patching him up with a shirt they found crumpled up on the floor. Once the wound was dressed, they scrubbed the blood from his face, mostly for Jackie's sake, as she kept fainting at the sight of it. The dolls stood over Thomas and watched as the slimy old man squirmed in fits of pain, waiting for him to wake up, hoping he'd make it to the morning. Each doll took turns nursing Thomas back to health through the night. They gave him water when he thirsted and food when he grew hungry. When he begged for pain relief, the dolls eagerly listened as he explained where the pain medication was located in the medicine chest. Lilith stirred throughout the night, wanting more flesh to eat and more blood to drink. Fiona and Carol appointed Brash Betty as guard. She embraced her role, willingly whacking the devil doll over the head when it got out of hand. Morning came. Thomas was alive. He opened his eyes to find 12 faces glowering at him.
What's going on? What happened?
As Fiona explained in detail what Thomas had done, he moaned, groaned, and apologized for the mess he had made.
Where's the doll now?
Tied to the bed, Carol said. Lilith growled awake, sending a shiver through Thomas's scarred body.
We can't hold her off forever,
Tina squealed.
She's hungry, so if you want to live to see another day, old man, you better fix this mess.
Easy, girl, easy, Fiona said, holding Tina back. She's right, you know. I don't know what I can do.
Thomas rubbed his forehead.
And I'm in no condition to do anything about it anyway.
Listen, geezer. Modest Molly grabbed a handful of Thomas's hair and yanked his head back. He cried out in pain. If it weren't for your sick fuck fantasy, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Quit being a little bitch and turn me back into a doll, damn it. The room fell silent. Molly turned to find everyone wide-eyed with mouths agape. Molly blinked innocently. Too much? A bit, said Nancy. Thomas pushed himself up on his elbow.
I only mean I don't know how to fix it. The ritual is for bringing her to life, not reversing it.
Lilith howled and pushed against the net.
Food. Now, where is he? Feed me.
Thomas winced and cringed at the sound of his lover wanting him as a food source.
What did I do?
He cried. You better think of something quick or I'm cutting her loose, Betty said.
I would have to check the book.
What book?
On the shelf in the basement. It's called Advanced Satanic Rites and Rituals.
We can't read, dumbass. Hannah kicked Thomas in the foot. He yelped in pain.
It's an old blue book. You can't miss it. It's the only one down there.
Hannah, Nancy, run downstairs and get the book, Carol said, snapping her fingers. The dolls dashed off, and within minutes they hoisted a thick book with frayed edges onto the floor next to Thomas. Hurry up, Hannah said, out of breath. Thomas forced his eyes open and reached for the book weakly.
I don't have the strength. Can one of you do it for me?
Hannah kicked him in the foot again. Did this help? Thomas cried out in agony. We're not messing around, greaseball, Carol said. Thomas wiped pain-filled tears from his cheeks as he thumbed through the pages to find a counter-ritual to turn the dolls back to inanimate objects. He furrowed his overgrown brow, crinkled his crooked nose, and pursed his chapped and peeling lips.
This one might work with a few adjustments.
Exhausted, he collapsed to the floor.
I don't have all the ingredients. I'm not sure it'll work at all without them.
We'll take that chance, Fiona said.
All right, but don't blame me if it fails.
Blame you?
Tiny Tina said.
This is all your fault anyway, you weirdo.
Thomas blushed as he remembered the hideous sexcapades he enjoyed with the monster howling and screeching in his bedroom, the same one who ripped a hole in his chest with her razor-sharp teeth. You don't have a choice, old man.
Let me rest for a bit before...
Lilith shrieked like a banshee from the bedroom. Thomas jumped, his ass cheeks clenching.
I guess I'll do it now.
He scratched his dandruff-infested head, not confident with how to proceed. Bringing his doll to life took years of planning. He couldn't improvise something like this, especially not knowing the consequences of performing such rituals. He couldn't have 12 Liliths on his hand. One was bad enough, but after a kick to the head from Hannah, he had no choice but to think of something, and quick. His life was over. The headline of the next day's papers would read, "Old Man Eaten by 12 Dolls." The coroner would come in and find only his bones and his sweaters and 12 dolls using toothpicks to clean their teeth. He gulped hard. His voice wavered. He embraced his fate and closed his eyes as he recited a ritual on the fly.
Bones to ashes, sinew to dust, muscle to stuffing, skin to porcelain, from being to object. Forgive me this sin of my lust. I beseech you to return to dolls, all of you.
He shouted that last line toward the bedroom where the evil Lilith lay, gnawing out of her restraints. There wasn't any smoke or windows rattling or tables shaking up off the floor, but there was silence. No pitter-patter of doll feet, no growling coming from the bedroom where Lilith was trapped on the bed. Thomas opened one eye slowly. No movements anywhere in the house. Relieved, he opened the other eye to find all the dolls lifeless on the living room floor. He found the energy and jumped to his feet.
It worked! Holy shit, it worked!
In spite of his injuries, Thomas danced around the living room. He danced all the way to his bedroom where he found a motionless, hideous-looking doll trapped under a net made of rope.
She's gone! She's gone!
Thomas howled and ran around his house until he collapsed into his favorite chair. After he caught his breath, he looked to the ceiling and raised his right hand.
I promise to be a good person from here on out and never again dabble in the occult to bring a doll to life to satisfy my fleshly desires. I'll get a blow-up doll instead. They're cheaper and won't eat you alive.
After cleaning the kitchen to rid his home of any memory of Lilith, Thomas collected all the doll bodies strewn about his house and lined them up on the sofa. Their defective bodies reminded him of a shameful week. All those porcelain faces now broken, all those pretty dresses splattered with his blood, and their once dainty shoes now ripped to shreds, all because of him. Then he thought of Mabel Heloise Davenport, who probably bled to death on her living room floor and was now alone, decomposing in the privacy of her home because of his greed. Waves of guilt crashed over him, making him wish he had never seen these dolls, or any doll. Exhausted from the last 2 days, he curled up in his favorite chair to watch a little television to clear his mind. He would take all the dolls, even Lilith, out to his backyard the next morning and burn them in a ritual bonfire. He was going to cleanse himself of the memory of these dolls for good and live a more wholesome life, maybe even volunteer for a worthy cause. Sometime around 10:30 that night, Thomas shifted in and out of sleep, the noisy television stirring him. He didn't hear the click of the back door opening. There was a strange thwack, squeak, whoosh, whoosh, thwack, squeak, whoosh, whoosh noise somewhere in the house. He knew his house well enough to know this was a foreign sound, but he just assumed it was something on the television and ignored it. Even as the thwack, squeak, whoosh, whoosh, thwack, squeak, whoosh, whoosh noise grew louder and more pronounced as it moved through the kitchen, then the living room. Before finally stopping at the side of his chair, he chose to ignore it. He didn't hear the whoosh sound as the cane moved through the air, but he certainly felt the cane meet the side of his head with a force strong enough to knock him to the floor. He opened his eyes in time to see a white-haired, fat-faced lady with curls so tight it made her head look pinched, pull back her arm and crack him in the head with her cane again. Thomas fell silent. Unable to move, he watched with bitterness bubbling inside him. Mabel Heloise, if you please, scoop up the dolls from the couch and tuck them into a large garbage bag. When she was done, she sneered at Thomas and left the way she came in. Except he didn't hear the back door open, but he did hear the knife drawer open, followed by the clanging of someone digging for a knife. The thwack, squeak, whoosh, whoosh, thwack, squeak, whoosh, whoosh sound of Mabel's legs and her cane came back into the living room. Thomas tried to cry out, The word stop rang out in his brain, but the knife entering his chest robbed him of the air needed to push the word out.